best way to teach media studies to students, I think, is to make them understand the importance of being analytic about the engagements they're having with the media that they routinely are immersed in. We have long traditions of literary study and literary analysis and criticism that go in the West back to the Greeks. And we think we have developed over the centuries a pretty good sense of what it means to create a critical framework and techniques of critical analysis for what comes in writing. Another of my hats is that I have taught in the English department at the University of Chicago for 35 years, as well as cinema and media studies. But I think the great challenge these days is to learn to bring to the experience of visual media, and especially motion picture media, a sense of, if you like, the rhetoric of that medium and its codes, and to see how even in a simple kind of experience like the one we're having in the room today at this conference, where we have 3 camera positions that are cutting back and forth between the speaker and the audience, there's a sign of kind of rhetoric in the way the audience is being inserted, the image of the audience is being inserted in relation to the image of the speaker. That's a very, very simple example, and of course our motion picture media are very complex, but that's the kind of thing we need to learn how to analyze. I think it's important to get students to understand that even though most of them are far more dexterous than I am, let's say, in manipulation digital media, there's a way in which they may be uncritical because they don't have the connection with the older traditions of criticism about visual media. The panel this morning that we had about visual culture was one in which several of us were presenting modern motion picture media, the kind of things we study in a film studies program or a media studies program. And there's a certain way in which it's easier to imagine how international collaboration will take place between those kinds of studies of visual media in those forms, because to the degree that the word is submerged and the image is elevated, we have at least the initial possibility of universal access. One of the points I was talking about today is how one of the founders of Hollywood, creators of Hollywood cinema, D.W. Griffith, thought that what he was doing was creating a universal language of image production. So that makes media studies a little bit more like science studies, in the sense that it lends itself to internationalization. But to take a kind of reverse U-turn in the discussion here, I want to suggest that one of the greater challenges is to think about those forms of humanities that are still word-based, where problems of translation and philology and deep cultural histories come into play when we're thinking about our 2 cultures together. And I think we're only just starting to figure out how to do that. We have departments of comparative literature, something that started out, I think, as a European field, but which is spread around the world. And in the European context, comparative literature assumed that its practitioners would have the requisite language skills in French and English and German and Spanish and Italian and so on, Greek and Latin, those European languages. But the European context is insufficient for thinking about comparative literature or comparative anything else now. So how do we do comparative literacies before we get to the digital and the new media and cinema and so on? How do we think about comparative literacies in much more far-flung global perspectives, where we want to be thinking about the relation between European philology and, let's say, South Asian philology, Chinese philology, What does it mean that the Chinese have, for example, in mainland China, produced simplified Chinese that now makes it difficult even for their own citizens to understand older Chinese characters? What are the implications of that for understanding Chinese literary history? I don't know if there's an equivalent moment in the history of Sanskrit or in Indian writing where things have gotten cut off from the cultural past. But in a sense, your whole history of the production of various languages out of Sanskrit is a story that works a little bit like this. The advent of English in the 18th and 19th century after Macaulay gives you another layer to your story. So it seems to me that the advantage of something like our Delhi Center to the Humanities is to put us in a position to do comparative humanities even in the more difficult registers of philology and literature in a way that we haven't before. And maybe therefore to start to think a little better about what role humanities will have in a future university where science is becoming more and more dominant. I think the internationalization of this problem requires international collaboration. So that's one of the reasons I'm excited about the Delhi Center here at the University of Chicago. You're right, but it's funny, I met a couple of colleagues who are part of the leadership of what used to be Presidency College in Calcutta last week. I had a lovely meeting with the two of them and two of my colleagues from Chicago. And as you may know, President's College, which has produced this distinguished lineage of scientists and humanists, many of whom have become very important in North America and Europe, beyond South Asia. This college has now established its own autonomy from the University of Calcutta. It's no longer one of the 30 colleges, it's its own place. And the new leadership of the college is actually trying to make the liberal arts absolutely central to what they're doing there. And it's a fascinating experiment, and I think there may be others like it to take place. It seems to fly exactly in the face of what's happening the world over, a little bit even in America, which is a place where the liberal arts education was so important to the formation of students for 100 years. But it's a bold experiment, so I'm very keen to follow it, and I'm happy to give them a little shout out, as we say, here, because I think their project is an experiment, we could call it, is something that is valiant. Well, more and more, because one of my first acts after becoming chair of the department was to bring in my very dear colleague Rochana Majumdar as a full voting member of the department. And although the department doesn't operate on an enormous scale and graduate student fellowships are expensive, so we can only manage so many, around a half a dozen a year. Last year we brought in a new PhD who's wanting to work on South Asian cinema with Rochana Majumdar, and so I think we're going to be building from there in ways that I'm very, very excited about. Rochana herself is working on the cinema societies of South Asia from about the time of independence through the 1980s, which is a story that somewhat parallels the story of the cinema societies in France, which helped produce the great French directors like Godard and Truffaut. There's a parallel story to tell here. Shall I tell one more story before I stop? A good example of how these film societies have helped create a high degree of sophistication, I think, in South Asian film discourse is that I've been recently made aware of this great Bengali director whose name is Gadip, right? Gadip, Ritvik Gadip, am I saying the name right? I had occasion to see a book that was published by the Times of India about Indian cinema. And it's a collection of articles sort of printed in. One of them from 1978 is an obituary of Ritwik Ghattab. And the analysis in this public newspaper, the Times of India, of what Ghattab's career meant was far more sophisticated than anything I can imagine appearing in the New York Times or the Times of London. In the way it presented Ghattab's relation to Italian neorealism and to certain strands of theory. It was extraordinary to see this, and one of the things that Rocina works on is these cinema societies, which I think help to create this sophistication, and which I think is going to make for some wonderfully rich conversations in the coming years between the kind of thing we do at the University of Chicago and elsewhere in North America and what's going on here in South Asia.